The city that was seen. The alarm's chime kept pulsing in the dark, a faint, tinny sound that barely pushed through the hush of the room. Maren slapped it off without looking, then lay still, waiting for the faint golden bleed of morning to push against the curtains. It didn't. The air felt grainy, metallic, like a basement after a storm. The clock's red digits had gone black, and the silence outside had an edge she couldn't name. She rolled out of bed anyway, bare feet finding the floor's cold seams. Her joints felt stiff, not with sleep but with something heavier. The window's frame was cold under her palm as she pushed the curtain aside. Where she expected the sun to rise, the horizon held only a wet-looking band of murk. Above it, in a sky too dark for dawn, hung a single round shape, deep crimson, the color of a coal in a dying stove. It pulsed faintly, not like light but like blood moving. Her throat closed. The thing wasn't the sun, it was an eye. She leaned closer without meaning to, forehead brushing the glass. The orb was huge. No, not just huge, but impossibly close, as if the sky were a lid and this was pressed against it. Its surface glimmered like lacquered flesh. At the center, a vertical slit formed, black as a drain, tightening until it seemed to pull the light around it. She had the sudden sense of being pinned, weighed, as if her breath were being counted. Nothing moved on the street below. Cars were stopped at crooked angles, doors ajar, as if their owners had stepped out mid-errand. The rooftops shone with the same red cast, making the shingles look wet. A plastic bag drifted along the curb, but no wind moved it. Maren backed from the window without realizing it, toes catching on the rug. A thick, low hum gathered in the walls, not electric, but animal. She pressed her fingers to her ears. It stayed there, in the marrow. The curtains shifted slightly, though the glass was closed. Her heart pounded in small, fast bursts. She thought of work, of her supervisor expecting her on the morning shift at the grocery store, of the break room clock, of the smell of burned coffee in its pot. Ordinary things, anchors, but they felt like details from a life she had already left behind. She stepped into the hallway. The apartment's light switches gave no response. The walls had taken on a dull rose glow, as though the paint itself were bleeding color. She heard a soft creak above her. At first she thought it was one of the building's usual noises, pipes, pigeons, the heat kicking. Then it came again, longer, dragging. Maren ducked into the hall closet and shut the door. The smell of old coats and detergent pressed in around her. She crouched, holding her phone, thumbs shaking on the screen. No bars, no clock, only a black rectangle reflecting her pale face. Above her head, a new sound joined the creak. Scratch. Long, measured strokes like someone dragging a single nail across wood. Not a scurry, not a shuffle, deliberate. She pressed her palm against the plaster. It vibrated faintly. The coats brushed against her back as if something had moved them. But no bird made that kind of rhythm. Each drag seemed to carve letters she couldn't see but could feel. A memory surfaced. Her father tracing words in spilled salt on a diner table when she was a child, spelling out jokes. That same careful patience was above her now, spelling something else into her ceiling. Her breath made little clouds in the closet air. The temperature had dropped. The coats brushed against her back as if something had moved them. She held still, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. The scratching stopped. For a moment there was only the hum, the low red hum that had no source. Then a flake of plaster fell from the ceiling, landing in her hair. Another fell across her phone screen, a pale crescent in the dimness. She imagined a finger on the other side, long and jointless, its nail old as stone. The eye in the sky was not just looking, it was searching. She had felt that the moment she saw it. Now it was writing. In the darkness of the closet, she thought she could smell something new, faint but unmistakable. A scorched odor like hot coins or old blood. The coat's sleeves swayed against her as though stirred by a breath. She closed her eyes and counted. though she had lost all sense of numbers, hoping the sound would fade. But the red glow behind her lids only deepened, and somewhere far above the building, the sky's great pupil narrowed, tasting the city street by street, room by room, until it found her name hidden in the dust. The ceiling gave a soft, hollow pop. She thought she heard a whisper threaded through the hum, a syllable repeated, low and unpronounceable. Her phone screen lit on its own, blank except for a single deep red dot. It pulsed in time with the thing in the sky. Outside the closet door, the apartment's hallway seemed to breathe, boards softly flexing, paint cracking in hairline streaks. She couldn't tell if the sound on the roof had stopped or only gone deeper into the building itself. Maren pressed her back to the wall, jaw locked, listening. The closet's air had become dense, heavy as water. The coats touched her arms like hands, and the hum built until it felt like a pulse under her skin. Then, faintly, she heard the scratching resume, this time not above her, but right at the closet door. The first drag across the door came so softly, she thought it might be the sound of her own sleeve rubbing the wood. Then it came again, longer, with the dry whisper of varnish grazing a nail. She clenched her jaw and counted slow breaths, trying to make the air go in even. The coat scraped the back of her neck as the door shivered. She pictured the hallway's scuffed baseboard, the grain of the wood, the gap where the latch never quite caught. In her mind, she traced the distance from the closet to the front door, saw the chain, the stubborn deadbolt that always took a firm hand. The shape of the exit felt not like freedom, but like a line in chalk on a schoolyard, easily smudged. The scratching stopped. A smear of silence spread through the apartment. It wasn't peaceful. It was the pause between an intake and a breath let out. She placed her palm flat against the closet floor and felt the board's faint vibration, like a cat purring in another room. The handle turned left, then right. It didn't rattle, it tested. Her thirst announced itself without warning, a sour mouth and the memory of cold tap water. She swallowed and tasted dust. Her phone still showed the pulsing red dot. She thumbed the screen and it stayed. No icons, no text. It was like staring down a well at night and seeing a single ember on its wall. She loosened her jaw and eased herself up in a crouch, the coats draped off their hooks like figures waiting their turn. She put her hand on the inside handle and found it slick. For an instant, she thought blood. Then she realized her palm had gone sweaty enough to film the metal. She breathed through her nose and counted to a number that felt like enough. She pulled the door open a crack. The hallway held its breath. The red wash from the windows made the paint look tender, as if touched too much. The hum in the walls pressed against her cheekbones. The scratching had left faint lines on the outside of the closet door, not deep enough to show wood, but clear. They crossed and straightened into near letters, then gave up halfway, as if the author had lost interest or had somewhere better to write. She slid out of the closet and stood barefoot in the hall. The boards were cold enough to sting. A smell like pennies left in a wet hand came from the ceiling. She caught herself wanting to go back into the closet and close the door and pretend it would hold. The childishness of that thought steadied her in a small way. If she was going to be childish, she might as well make coffee. In the kitchen, she flicked the switch out of habit, then thumbed the lighter for the stovetop. The lighter sparked and failed. She ran water and let it cold as it came. The pipes shuddered like something trapped in them. She drank from the stream and thought of river water under thin ice, a taste clean and iron at once. The refrigerator hummed a note that didn't belong to any machine. The magnets on its door shivered as if set on a speaker. She found the battery radio in the junk drawer under the takeout menus. It felt light, less real than memory. She flicked the dial until it caught a station through the static, a voice flattened by distance and fear. The words came as fragments, as if cut by a dull knife. The word advisory arrived intact, followed by remain and indoors. Then a soft, orderly phrase about calm. Someone laughed far away from the mic. A hand smacked something, and the laugh went quiet. Maren turned the volume down until the voice became only shape. It made the apartment feel less alone, as if somewhere invisible adults had it handled. She laughed too once, without sound. The window over the sink showed the same thing the bedroom had, only nearer. The red light flattening distance until the buildings across the alley looked as if she could reach and peel them up like linoleum. On one roof, a silver vent cap spun without wind. Under it, a dark film moved in a slow circle as if a puddle were breathing. She looked away quickly and set the radio on the counter. The host's voice returned to the same few words, unspooling an advisory that never ended. Work, she thought. The store would be dark. The long aisles, the stacked canned goods marching under low ceiling tiles. The compressor room bleeding its patient little sigh, the frozen doors gloved with condensation. She pictured unlocking the front and waiting for people to show, for someone to hand out a plan. When fear felt too big, her mind looked for tasks like anyone might look for a handrail on stairs. She dressed by touch, jeans that still held the crease of yesterday, sweater that had stretched at the cuffs, boots stiff at the heel. In the bathroom, she swiped a finger through the little mirror, fogless space, and saw a white face with sleep pressed into it, and a mouth that didn't like the feel of itself. She splashed water on her cheeks and didn't meet her own eyes for long. The overhead light, when she tried it, gave a dull, glassy thud inside the fixture and nothing more. At the front door, she paused with her hand on the bolt. The radio offered another slice of speech. City services, reduced, essential, do not. And the building S hallway beyond her door seemed to wait for her like a road in a forest. She slid the bolt and lifted the chain and stepped out. The hall smelled like old carpet and warm dust, the way it always did, and also like the inside of a used battery. The emergency light over the stairwell glowed feebly, red at its edges, so that the white plastic looked like something skinned. The stairs carried the same hum as the apartment walls, and the closer she got to the ground floor, the more it felt like standing on a sheet of metal while someone dragged a magnet under it. No voices, no doors opening, no thud of newspapers against thresholds. She placed her boots carefully to avoid the spots where the paint had bubbled. When she pushed the outer door, she expected night air. What she got was a thin, cool breath that smelled like old rain and the mouth of a coin purse. It filled her lungs and stayed there, a weight. The street had that holiday morning quiet, but twisted, the kind that fell when a winter storm cancelled everything. Only this was dry and still. Traffic lights hung at a frozen attention. The reds looked like toys compared to the sky's cast, prim little dots against a washed field of meat-colored light. The single eye hung there patient as a nail-head. The black slit at its center had narrowed further. She felt that the slit wasn't empty. It was packed with a darkness more crowded than night. Cars stood at angles, some with doors hanging open, as if their owners had stepped away to pick something up and fallen through a trapdoor. On the store's corner, the newspaper box S window showed a front page where a headline stretched out and never quite finished the sentence. She took a step toward it and saw the letters blur and swim into loops. Her eyes watered. She went on. Her boots sounded too loud. The sound bounced off brick like a hand clap in an empty church. She wanted the soft racket of early deliveries, the forklift's cough behind the store, the rattle of someone rolling a dolly over the ramp. Instead, there was the hum, and under it a slow knock that had no direction. The back door of the store clicked with the key she'd kept under her mailbox, a key she had never used this way. When she opened it, the alarm should have screamed. It made a half-hearted wheeze and died like a trumpet played underwater. She stood still, waiting for the old familiar scold of the keypad. And when nothing came, she realized she was listening for rules to hold. The little green ready light near the desk had turned a color she had no name for, something picked from a bruise. Inside, the scent of cleaning chemicals and chilled air met her. The freezer's breath had the same red taint as everything else. It made the hair on her arms stand up. The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered without light, their own weak hum trying to find the frequency of the bigger one and failing. The linoleum underfoot had a nearly oily glide that wasn't there yesterday. The produce case looked like a stage where someone had forgotten the actors. Plastic misters still puffed a faint coolness over greens that had dulled into the color of old felt. Her hand reached out and touched a head of lettuce. It trembled, not leaf by leaf, not with water. The whole thing yielded and reformed under her palm like a chest taking a breath. She flinched and stepped back, eyes on her fingertips, as if expecting them to come away green. Down the deli aisle, the Slicer S blade caught the red wash and turned it into a dry shine. She didn't look too closely at the meats. The bakery case had fogged itself opaque. A single fly sat on the glass, dark and still, its wings making little adjustments without sound. At the front registers, screens were lit with that same red point that had taken her phone, a dot-dead center beating. The conveyors clicked now and then as if an unseen hand set an item down and then decided against it. Maren walked along them and saw a paper bag someone had folded too carefully, the creases sharp as cuts. Next to it lay a receipt half spooled from the printer, the paper thin enough to show what was printed on the back or maybe through it. Lines of text had stacked themselves into the same loops as the newspaper headline. When she turned her head, the loops seemed to straighten into letters she almost knew. She didn't try to read. Her head had started to throb. She went into the break room to hang up her coat. The couch had a dent in it shaped like someone sitting forward. The coffee pot stood dry, its bottom stained a permanent brown. A mug on the counter held a ring like a tide line. The bulletin board's notices curled at the corners. Someone had tacked up a flyer with bold letters that had softened into red ash. The guidelines on it mentioned safety and procedure and something called event, and then the words spread like oil and wouldn't be read. She found the landline. Its dial tone tried and failed to be steady. She pressed a number she knew without looking, one that went to her mother's house, the old place, with the blue porch and the lilac that grew too close to the step. The line didn't ring. It breathed. She held it to her ear anyway because something regular had once lived at the other end. And then she set it down gently, like a thing that might bruise. The radio she carried in had gone quiet. She turned the knob until the static grew loud enough to remind her that sound could be ordinary. Behind the static, something else spoke once, just enough to shape a word that might have been everyone. Then the band slipped away. She went to the front of the store and unlocked the doors. It was an act of faith rather than sense. The hushed red morning looked in at her without blinking. Across the street, the pharmacy's sign trailed letters from its plastic track like teeth. The little diner on the corner had its chairs up on tables and no one moving inside. The smell that moved through the open doors had the same money and rain metallic taste and something under it, a yeast of old cellars. When she closed the doors again, the glass gave a sound like a damp finger moving on the rim of a glass bowl. She rubbed her hands together and went to the back room. The compressor unit coughed once and then settled into a rhythm that threatened to be familiar. It clicked, waited, clicked, waited. She stood there listening to it not fail. Something dug its nail down the far side of the wall, a shallow testing scrape, as if tracing the path of cable. Her mind made a plan with the bones of routine. Face the shelves, count down the drawer, check dates, walk the aisles and keep the place looking like it still belonged to a day. She started in canned goods. The labels had all gone slightly fuzzy, as if condensation had formed on the inside of the paper. Tomato and broth and pea had collapsed into pale circles and darker ones. Her fingers found dust where no dust ever lasted. She wiped the edges of cans and felt grit that didn't come away, a fine ash that meant to be part of the metal. She talked to herself in the way she sometimes did when she'd been alone too long on a slow shift. Nothing dramatic, just a humming. If she stopped entirely, the store's hum would be all there was. Her voice, thin as it was, let her pretend the place still had corners she understood. By the time she reached the end of the aisle, some new part of her was tired. Not her legs, not her back, not even her head. It was the part that kept one foot moving, that told the hand what to reach for. It had run thin like a belt on a pulley. She sat on an empty pallet near the warehouse door and rested her elbows on her knees. The eyes in the sky had been just the one when she left home. Now, sitting here, she couldn't shake the sense of more, not visibly, but along the vessel walls of the morning, as if that one slit peered, and 1,000 smaller slits peered with it from places that had never known light. Her mouth felt full of iron again. In the wall, a slow weight shifted, the kind of sound a big animal makes sleeping. She could have left. She could have locked the doors and walked back to her apartment and gone under her quilt and held still until sleep came or did not. The thought ran through her like someone else's joke. Here was easier. Here had tasks. On her second pass through the aisles, she found small differences, a pyramid of soup cans that she remembered leaving slightly off, now stacked perfectly symmetrical. The exactness made her heart thud. If symmetry had arrived in the last few minutes, it meant a hand had done it. She scanned the aisle and saw no one. The ends of the rows blurred into the red light. Her breath made a small white in the cool air and slid away. She heard the sound then, faint and regular as a clock in another room. Scratch, long, pause, scratch. It came from above, not the ceiling itself, but the roof's skin, translated through tar and timber to the shelves. It traced lines in a language she would learn whether or not she wanted it. She went to the stairwell that led to the roof hatch. Store policy said off limits without a second person present. The thought of policy made her feel less alone. A tiny, invisible supervisor standing in her ear. She took hold of the rail and climbed. The metal steps held the building S pulse and handed it straight through the bones of her arm. At the top, the hatch's bolt sat in its place as always, orange with old rust. The metal felt warmer than it should have. That warmth traveled into her hand like a fever. She pulled. The bolt slid with surprising ease, as if it had been moved a moment before. She tipped the hatch up and was hit with air so red and thin she had to close her eyes and cough once to make it fit. The sky's eye sat huge and near, taking up more of the world than she had words for. The slit at its center opened the small space it needed, and no more. The roof felt soft under her boots. The tar bubbled in blisters that held little red reflections. Leaves lay glued to the surface like fish caught in ice. She stepped carefully, boots lifting strings of tacky black, and made her way to the place above her apartment where the scratching had spoken earlier. It was there, the writing. It covered an area the size of her living room rug, lines cut with a single persistent tool, deep enough to show lighter wood under tar in some places. The letters weren't hers. They weren't the language on any label. They were straight where she expected curve and hooked where she expected clean angle. Still, as she stood over them, something in her mouth shaped an answer, as if the message had been addressed to that small, moving part of her, and not to her eyes at all. She didn't try to speak. She let the answer sit there, heavy and cold as a coin on her tongue. A breeze would have felt like a blessing. There was none. The world waited. A thin tap-tap began at the edge of the hatch and came toward her, each step the sound of finger bone on tar. She turned in time to see the nail drag itself across the roof skin without a hand behind it, long, and yellowed, with a curve like a sickle and a dullness that might have been age or mercy. It moved like a beetle crossing a table, certain of where it was going. She took a step back and almost laughed, the sound thin and wrong. The nail stopped at the message, hesitated, then added a line lengthwise across the letters, as if underlining or striking through. Underline felt too human. Strike felt right. She could have run then. She could have slammed the hatch and braced her back against it and listened to the nail click on metal until the building learned that rhythm. Instead, she crouched because her legs had made up their mind and looked closer. The cut tar flaked upward at the edges like hangnails. She slid one fingertip along the nearest groove and felt a shudder pass through the roof itself, as if somewhere below a sleeping thing had been tickled. The nail moved back a little and then forward again, eager, like a dog inviting. The slit above narrowed until the circle of red went almost black. The hum found a new note that wove into the others and held. A phrase came to her then, nothing poetic, just the sort of line you might scrawl on a sticky note to remind yourself of something that matters more than you admit. I see you. The phrase didn't arrive from her memory. It arrived the way a smell arrives when the door to a basement is opened, the air exhaling what it has held too long. She tried to stand. Her knee told her it would rather not. She remained crouched under the pier of the eye and felt her skin try to climb off her bones. When she lifted her hand, the pulse in her wrist matched the red light's throb. The nail drew a small mark at the end of the underlining and paused, as if punctuation had been considered completed. It lifted, and as it lifted she saw that it had no shadow of its own. The shadows had all been taken by the one big thing. Somewhere below, a compressor kicked and held steady. The steadiness sounded human in its way. She felt the urge to go down and check on it, to do her rounds, to make the store ready for no one. Instead, she stayed where she was, letting the eye measure her. A bird made of shadow crossed between the eye and the city and left no impression. The nail tested the tar again, this time scratching a shape that had no letter in it at all. It looked like a path on a map. It looked like the crack in her bathroom mirror where the frame had warped. It looked like the line you draw when you keep your pen on the page, while your mind is elsewhere. It looked, finally, like the seam of a lid. She said one word then, without planning it. Not a prayer, not a plea. Just her name, as if returning a roll call from a teacher who might write it wrong if she didn't say it herself. Maren. The sound went nowhere. It stayed at her feet and stuck to the tar. The radio in her pocket woke and spoke one clear sentence. It wasn't a voice from any station she had heard. It sounded like a man whose lungs had learned a new way to work. It said, very softly, that looking down makes a kind of sense. She stared at the letters she couldn't read. She nodded without deciding to. She looked down. The city didn't ripple, didn't turn strange all at once. It simply confessed what it had always been doing while no one bothered to notice. The streets lay in their red wash like tendons. The alley behind the pharmacy ran in a clean curve that matched a vein she had once seen on a diagram in a pamphlet at a clinic. The park ovals of grass had turned the color of old meat and made a cluster that looked more like a gland than a place for picnics. The roofs weren't roofs, they were scales. She closed her eyes and kept seeing it. The slit at the eye's center narrowed again, not as a threat, but as a blink might be in a creature that had learned blinking for someone else's comfort, and now practiced it out of habit. The nail touched her boot. It was lighter than it looked. She flinched anyway. It made one small, patient tap above her toes. When she didn't move, it tapped again. There was a kindness in the way it didn't scratch. She stood. The nail followed as if on a string, tip hovering just above the tar. She walked to the hatch and felt the roof skin stretch very slightly as if reluctant. The nail waited while she set a boot on the rung. It followed her down the metal stairs, tapping lightly, then paused at the top and stayed there, courteous at the threshold, like a hand that could reach through but chooses to knock. Back on the floor, she locked the hatch. The bolt slid home with a pleasing clunk. The nail tapped once on the metal skin and fell quiet. The eye's red presence came through the hatch like sunlight through a heavy curtain. She went down into the warehouse and spoke out loud to steady herself. Told the compressor it was doing fine, told the shelves they looked good, told the registers they would behave. Her voice got friendlier the more she used it, like a muscle warming. She pushed a mop bucket out from under the sink. The mop water ran pinkish, though she hadn't added anything to it yet. She swirled the mop and watched suds gather in a tight circle, then spin away as if shy. She mopped the front tiles in long, slow passes. The lines she left looked clean and wrong at the same time, each wet streak too straight for a human wrist. It pleased some part of her to see order in the aisle, a space made ready. The radio spoke once more in that same new voice and told no one that lights inside should remain dim. She left the switches alone, though none worked anyway. Around midday, if that was what to call a time with no arc to the light, she heard footsteps outside. They came hesitant, stopped, came again. Someone tried the front door handle. It made a respectful metal cough and held. The person outside leaned their forehead to the glass and breathed fog into a circular patch. Through it, she saw a face she knew. Nessa from the bakery 2 blocks over, her hair in the same poorly pinned bun, her mouth small and flat. Maren moved to the door and set her hand on the bar, but didn't push. Nessa's lips formed words. Maren could make out water and help and please. She put her own mouth close to the glass and said, "We have water," and pointed back toward the employee sink. The glass made their voices do something odd. The words feel loose and heavy, unable to fly far enough to count. Nessa's eyes lifted above Maren's head toward the ceiling, not really at anything, but toward the big fact. She nodded, pressed her hand flat to the glass as people do when they want to touch without touching, then stepped back. Her shoes made no sound on the sidewalk. She moved away toward the pharmacy, pausing once to look up. The sky didn't look back. It kept looking down. Maren waited, listening to the empty shape Nessa left. Then she unlocked the door and brought in a stack of plastic jugs from the stock. She set them by the front, wrote the word "take" on a piece of cardboard with a grease pencil and leaned it against the pile. The letters she made wriggled a little, as if someone under the cardboard moved. She ignored that and propped the door open a hand's width, enough for a breath to pass. People came and did not. The city made a show of emptiness and then produced a lone dog that walked with careful feet along the curb. A boy on a bicycle rolled past with his mouth open and his eyes closed, as if letting the red light pour in. A bus sat angled into the intersection, its doors open, the driver's seat empty, the overhead route sign blank. Maren stayed at her post like a lighthouse keeper without a foghorn and watched. When she grew tired of watching, she cleaned again. She wiped the glass cases until the red light painted her reflection into a blurred coin. She stacked bakery bags in even tens, then shook her head and made the stacks less perfect. She turned the register keys and felt their white plastic give like a nail bed pressed too hard. She threw away a bouquet of helium balloons left over from a promotion, but they didn't drift toward the trash. They hung stubborn in the air, a finger S length above the floor, until her patience left them, and then they let go and sank slow, as if the air had thickened to syrup. The letters over the break room sink had always bothered her, a scrawl someone had carved with a box cutter years ago. Now they set her teeth on edge. She scrubbed at them. They gleamed red and stayed. She ate a granola bar she found in her locker, even though she had no appetite. The wrapper clung to her fingers. The bar itself tasted like sweet chalk, and something else, a spice she couldn't place. She washed it down with tap water that ran cold and a little gritty. It left her stomach feeling scoured. She felt better for having done the ordinary thing of eating. An hour or a day later, a low truck pulled into the lot and stopped halfway, its motor off, though it had not driven up. A man in a security jacket got out, looked at the sky once, then at the store. He did not come closer. He stood where he was and held a bullhorn to his mouth and said in a tired voice that people should remain indoors, that services were limited, that help would be coordinated. He did not point at any direction where help might be. He repeated himself, and the way he repeated made Maren think he had said the same words at other corners to other empty storefronts. When he finished, he put the bullhorn down, rested his hands on the truck's roof, and cried with his head lowered, not loudly, the way a man cries when he thinks shoulders and breath should manage the work. Then he got in, and the truck sat and then moved without sound, and went. The hum that underlay everything had shifted in that time, acquired a rasp, a small catch, like a record with a skip. Her nerves settled around that catch. It offered something to brace against. She was mopping the same line again when the roof felt light over her head, as if a pressure had lifted. For a moment she thought the eye had left. She looked up into the ceiling tiles and saw a stain like a handprint that hadn't been there, and under it the light turned thin like skin. She went upstairs. The hatch bolt felt cooler. When she opened it, the red wasn't gone. It had pulled back the way a tide leaves a strand of weed on rocks. The slit at the center of the eye had widened to a tasteful degree, a host in a doorway. The nail lay on the tar like a tool between jobs. The writing on the roof had grown deeper in places where she had not watched it. Rain that wasn't tea water had darkened the grooves and turned them into lines with depth enough to hold a finger. She went to the letters and placed her palm flat. The roof didn't shudder this time. It sighed. The sigh belonged to the building and to something else. The words didn't turn into English. They turned into instruction. She didn't need to own the steps to follow them. She went back down without hurry, crossed the store, unlocked the employee-only door to the back hallway, and moved through the dim to the stair that led to the basement storage. The metal barrier at the top of those steps had always been sticky. It yielded easy now, metal kissing metal, the way a blade kisses a whetstone. The air down there carried a coolness that made her mouth water. The concrete steps had a fine grit of flour or ash, or both. At the bottom she paused and let her eyes decide if they would widen or not. They did. The basement had always been small, a rectangle with pallets and plastic-wrapped stacks and the smell of damp cardboard. It had grown a little, not longer, deeper. The back wall that had always held its brick proudly now seemed thinner by a hand's width, with a seam running along it like the place a cheap cabinet will split if you force it. The seam had not been there yesterday. The hum came strong in that room, clean and clear in her chest. She ran her fingers along the seam and felt warmth at the edges. The warmth moved, not steady, but in little returns, like the breath of something large waiting to be named. She pressed her palm against the line and pushed. The wall didn't give. It softened and then stiffened back, a muscle playing with its own strength. She thought about calling out. She thought about a joke. She thought briefly about her mother and the lilac and a Sunday where she had sat on those steps with a bowl of strawberries and wished to be anywhere else. That wish seemed as practical now as it had then. In the end, she kept her hand where it was and leaned. Her shoulder met the brick. The mortar along the seam made a dry whisper. The wall moved enough to admit nothing, then a little more. A small flake broke free and drifted down the line like a slow tear. She brought her other hand to it. Her breath hitched at the back of her throat and held. The seam opened the way a mouth opens to sip. It did not gape. It did not crack. It parted with restraint and offered a passage that no one had taught her to see before now. The space beyond was not black. It was red, but not the hard red of the sky. It was soft, the red of a room lit by a lamp through a scarf. It breathed. Maren thought of the instruction she had felt under her palm on the roof. It did not say enter. It did not need to. It said only remember. She did not know what to remember, so she brought to mind the childish thought from the morning about coffee and the way the fridge magnets had shivered, and the exact feel of her boots lifting strings of tar on the roof. She held those in her head the way a person holds a match to see their keys, careful not to burn the fingers. She stepped forward. The wall resisted until it did not. The red air on the other side settled over her shoulders like a shawl. It smelled like iron and yeast and old paper. It smelled, suddenly, like the kitchen of her childhood on a winter evening, steam lifting from a pot on the back burner, the window's corner feathered with frost. The floor tilted only a little. She kept her balance with the easy skill of someone who had worked all her life on polished floors that want to betray you sometimes. The red settled deeper. Her ears popped. Behind her the seam closed a fraction, but not in a hurry. Ahead, the space widened a step at a time. The hum she had carried in her bones since morning found an echo that matched it perfectly and then overtook it the way a stronger voice will in a call and response. Maren let her arms hang and moved forward as if grocery store pallets had been stacked in a new aisle there for her to straighten. She came to a stop when the space presented something that could only be called a counter. It was not a counter. It was a length of flesh-like fabric stretched over something that held. It was warm under her palms. It offered no objects, no till, no paper, no items. It offered a waiting posture, the way a store counter offers a place for exchange. She stood at it and felt the exact rightness of standing at it. The red shifted in the distance. A shape approached that never had to touch the floor to count as there. It arrived without the burden of feet. It carried the careful air of a manager from another department brought in to help. When it settled across from her, the feeling of relief that came over her was so strong, she nearly laughed, too loud for the room. She did not laugh. She pressed her mouth into a line and kept both hands on the counter. The shape extended what could be a hand. On the end of it, the nail, long, slightly curved, patient. It tapped once. The tap felt like a question that had only one good answer and several others that would be accepted anyway. She thought for a mad second of returns. It made the same sense as anything else. She pictured all the paper returns she had processed at the store. Items that came back because they were the wrong brand, the wrong size, the wrong day. She had never judged a soul for bringing something back. Everyone tries. She put her own hand forward. The nail didn't pierce. It flipped the way a coin flips, and the blunt side rested on her knuckles with the weight of authority signed off and sealed. An agreement formed without words. It had no fine print. It had only one line, and she knew it already. I see you. When the touch broke, she felt something that wasn't loss. It was more like the way you feel after signing your name a little too hard, the pen point digging through more than one sheet. Relief and a small foolish pride. She had been noticed. She had stood at the right counter and done the thing required, and now the transaction could proceed. The shape made no move to recede. It stood with her and waited with her, as if both of them were watching for a customer. The red air around them thinned until she could almost see individual strands, like threads in a curtain, finally admitting to being fabric. On the far wall, a darker line appeared, then another, arranging themselves into that near-understandable script. She didn't try to read. The reading would be a job for someone else later, in a room with better chairs. Her job lay here, hand on the counter, breath as steady as she could make it, being seen. After a time, the red pulled back another degree. She felt herself return to her body the way a sweater returns from the line, slightly different, holding a new shape. She looked at her hand and saw 4 fine, pale crescents along her knuckles, where the nail had rested, neat as moon phases. The skin didn't hurt. It felt tender, like a place that will bruise without showing it. The seam in the brick, behind her now, opened to the size it had been when she came in, which was more than it had been yesterday and less than the world might allow. She took a breath that felt like the first clean mouthful after a fever and stepped back through. The store came up around her as if she had been gone an hour or a moment. The hum slipped once and found its level. She washed her hands at the sink because that is what you do after you go somewhere new. The water ran clear. When it struck the metal basin, it made a sound like coins being counted slowly. She dried them on a towel that had been white for too long. She hung the towel straight and fixed its crooked corner. The afternoon, call it that for convenience, settled into a steady, near quiet. Every so often the hatch above ticked as if cooling. A few people came by and took water, their faces turned polite and red in the wash. No one asked questions that would need answers. They moved the way people move when the rules of a room are not posted but felt. Maren stood behind the counter at the front and kept her hands ready, and the registers glowed with their single point, and the conveyor belts occasionally migrated an inch and stopped. Late, no sunlight to say it, only the body guessing. She locked the front and did a final turn through the aisles. The greens in produce lay as quiet as stones. The bakery's fogged glass had melted trails in it like snail paths. In the freezer doors, her reflection made a long, dark slit at the center where her eyes met. In the break room, she sat and let the couch dent around her. The bulletin board S notices had arranged themselves without her help into a grid too even to be chance. A new sheet had appeared that wasn't paper, a skin with writing in the roof script laid over it like frost. She didn't touch it. She let her head fall back and listened to the building settle into the night that wasn't T-night, the day that had given up on being a day and chosen to be itself. Before she left, she went upstairs again to the roof. The hatch bolt moved like a friend letting you back in after you forgot your keys. The red had drawn a little further off, still holding the city under it, like a hand holds a small animal calming itself. The eye maintained its round face, patient, full of a power that didn't require show. The slit watched and did not claim the watching as work. The writing on the roof had grown again. Someone had added a new line that ran under the letters, and back around to meet itself, a loop that meant complete in no language she spoke. The nail lay quiet at the edge like a pen put down. Maren stood in the chill and let the rooftop grit print small circles into the thin soles of her boots. She thought very simply of coming back, of opening the store in the red morning and standing her post, of checking the seam in the brick the way you check a rising dough gently, the pad of a finger leaving a dent that accepts and then gives back. She thought of the hum and how it matched her pulse. She thought of being seen. A subway of clouds moved under the eye, slow and obedient. No wind touched her hair. Down in the street, a siren tried out a couple of notes and changed its mind. Somewhere a compressor held its breath and then remembered the next part of the rhythm. She went home not because she had to, but because the day's shape asked her to. The hallway of her building had cooled. The emergency light had given up the ghost and sat dull and apologetic in its plastic cage. In her apartment, the kitchen held its place as if nothing had shifted, though everything had. The phone lay where she had left it, the dot on its face mild now, less insistent, the pulsing lazy as a cat near sleep. She stood at the window and looked out at the calm red city. She saw movement here and there, small and considered. She saw the way the streets mapped themselves without needing a map. The eye hung like a ceiling ornament in a room where someone has already rearranged the furniture and wants you to notice eventually on your own. She lay down on her bed without undressing, boots set neatly side by side on the rug. The ceiling over her had hairline cracks that had not been there last night. They made a pattern like branches under snow. She traced them with a fingertip in the air. The fingertip kept time with the hum. She closed her eyes lightly. The dark behind them was not black. It had red in it, but not the hurt kind. It was a shade people had loved in parlors once, when evening meant talk and the radio and a war long ago. She let her breath fall into the rhythm she had been given, and when the scratching started again, this time faint and restful, and not asking but simply writing what it knew, she didn't hide. She listened and learned the strokes one by one. When she finally slept, the eye was still there and would be there. The new god had written its message and underlined it and placed a period that looked like a nail, seen end on. Dawn would never be gold again in this city, and a person could live with that. You could write down inventory by the red light and keep the shelves decent and count out the drawer though no one asked. You could tend a seam in a wall that breathed a little and use the pad of your finger to understand when it needed another look. You could stand at the counter in a room no one had named yet and answer to your own name when the roll was called. She slept like someone who had finally been given a position and understood what shifts would be asked, and the hum under the city kept time with the moving of her breath, and the skies slit, watched not as a guard, not as a judge, but as a manager who has learned to trust a worker to close up properly. A soft sound came from the roof, the gentle polish of nail on tar, no longer a warning, not yet a lullaby. The steady writing of an order filled and ready for pickup, a receipt pinned with a blunt crescent through its corner, in a place beyond the reach of any register, where no totals mattered and no figures needed listing. Only the careful, decent act of marking that it had been seen. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.